So just want to say a quick acknowledgement that we are, of course, on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam peoples. So just wanted to, as a longtime liver in Vancouver, want to acknowledge their stewardship over the land. Daisy and I will be talking today a little bit about our experience here with carbon pricing in British Columbia. Starting off talking a little bit about the context, because every jurisdiction is different and every jurisdiction's experience with carbon pricing is different. We'll also talk a little bit about the different forms our carbon pricing takes in British Columbia, and talk a bit about also how we use that revenue and what are some of the initial evidence of success that we've already gotten from it. So one of the important contexts is British Columbia has a pretty robust set of climate policy, but one important part obviously is setting our goals. What are our targets? And so we have a number of different targets: the 16% reduction by 2025, 40% by 2030, 60% by 60% by 2040, 80% by 2050. And we also have a commitment to have net zero emissions by 2050. And of course, the difference between the 80% 2050 commitment and the net zero is that there will be an opportunity to reduce gross emissions by 80%, but we could get down to net zero through different ways to be reducing the remaining emissions. For example, through the direct air capture, carbon capture and sequestration, or BC eligible offsets. On top of our targets as a tool to be able to further reduce emissions, we also had established sectoral targets just so that it helps to be managing the process and helps to be managing our strategy to be reducing emissions. So as you can see, we have separate emission reductions for transportation, the oil and gas sector, other industry, and buildings and communities. So the context in which that we have our set of climate policy and our carbon pricing is British Columbia is a reasonably large emitter in Canada. Of all the provinces in Canada, we are about the 5th largest emitter. And you can see inside the pie graph, it lists about where those emissions come from inside our economy. A big part about BC is traditionally, we've always been an exporter of natural resources. And particularly now it's going to a greater degree to the Asian market. We produce a lot of those products that had been mentioned in the very first presentation to be facilitating a transition to a cleaner economy. Products like copper, aluminum, and other critical minerals will be critical to be achieving the transition of the economy that is necessary. We also produce a lot of natural gas. And it's likely growing as we expand into liquefied natural gas. We are, relative to other jurisdictions across North America, very low emissions intensity. Still, it has a material contribution of emissions of up to about 20%. We are blessed with a clean electricity grid, largely powered by legacy hydro, and which has benefits, is that it helps us to be reducing emissions inside the transportation sector, inside buildings, and also inside industry. But it also has a drawback in that most economies, when they're looking to reduce emissions, the easiest job is to be reducing emissions in electricity generation. We, of course, with 98% renewable electricity, have already done that. So our subsequent emissions reductions are a little bit more expensive and difficult. So carbon pricing isn't a silver bullet to be resolving all types of emission reductions. So as we implement it in BC, it's a part of a suite of policies to be helping to be facilitating and supporting and supplementing the carbon tax. And also it helps to be addressing emissions that carbon pricing either can't or doesn't address inside the province. So with industry, we have a policy to achieve, which Daisy is actually lead on, to be achieving net zero emissions from new industrial facilities. We have a commitment to be reducing all industrial methane emissions and addressing particularly those in the oil and gas sector. We have an oil and gas emissions cap to be reducing by 2030 oil and gas emissions by 33 to 38%. And we also have a fund to support emission reductions inside the industrial sector. On top of that, in the non-industrial sectors, we look at landfill gas capture inside our landfills. We work to be reducing the emissions of our electricity sector through calls to power. So we were one of the first jurisdictions in North America to be having a broad-based carbon tax. And what I mean by broad-based is it is a tax that covers about 70% of the province's emissions, all of those from the use and combustion of fossil fuels. And so what this is, when it initially came out, and it has evolved since then, is they apply to each and every ton that was emitted by individuals, by businesses, and by industry. And Daisy will talk a little bit about how that evolved a bit since then. What its intention, of course, is that people are aware, is to be driving just to be addressing the pollution that's being caused by fossil fuels, and to be helping to be encouraging people to be moving towards a cleaner economy. We are very conscious also about making sure that the effects of the carbon tax is minimalized, and we have things like the climate action tax credit to support affordability for individuals and to be supporting industry through things like the Clean BC Industry Fund. So since we have implemented the tax, the feds also have come in, and as you can see from the red line, they're greatly increasing the price of carbon tax up to 2030. And that what we've done is kind of create a system that both ourselves and the feds agree is equivalent to that. So one of the biggest challenges is how to be addressing industrial emissions. So naturally, we want to be avoiding carbon leakage, which, as all of us know, is the situation where industry and its related emissions move from a jurisdiction that has a higher carbon price to a lower carbon price. And of course, the drawback of that is that it doesn't actually reduce emissions. It hampers the economy of the jurisdiction that faces carbon leakage, and it could actually lead to increased emissions. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that and trying to be finding that balance between setting a clear price signal to be reducing emissions while also mitigating the carbon leakage risk. So one thing that we always note is that carbon leakage would become less of an issue at the point where more jurisdictions are pricing carbon. But at the current time, that's not exactly happening. But what I'm going to do is pass the floor over to Daisy, who will talk a little bit about what steps we've taken on industrial pricing.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey about how our carbon pricing system has changed over the past 15, 16 years. I think 2008 was when the carbon tax was initially introduced. At the start of the carbon tax applying to industrial emissions, it applied to all emissions, and it applied for the most part upfront. And it applied to the use and combustion of fossil fuels. In 2018, we introduced the Clean BC Industrial Incentive Program, which was a direct intervention to further support competitiveness under an increasing carbon price. So that system saw a portion of the carbon tax refunded to high-performing facilities. The graph over on the left there shows that essentially it was a percentage of your carbon tax above a certain value could be refunded if you were at or below a world-leading benchmark. So essentially, it was a way to encourage industry to reduce their own emissions and to reduce their exposure to the carbon price if they were performing particularly well. In 2020, late 2021, I think it was November, the BC government released its roadmap to 2030, Clean BC roadmap to 2030. This was our plan for how we were going to meet our 2030 target that Harian spoke about earlier. In that roadmap, we made a commitment to enhance our carbon pricing system. So we undertook a carbon pricing review, and that took place in 2022. We engage with industry, First Nations, equity-seeking groups on a whole variety of different carbon pricing scenarios for both industry and households. You know, the impacts of a carbon price are felt very differently by those two kind of broad groups. Some of the, you know, with the competitive lens still very kind of important and central to how we were looking to develop the carbon price going forward. Some of the key feedback we heard from industry, perhaps unsurprisingly, was around a need for policy certainty, protections, ongoing protections for competitiveness. We heard a lot about the need for flexibility in how to comply with a pricing regime, and also a strong desire to be able to use offsets towards any compliance obligation. As Harian mentioned, the federal government in Canada had also announced that it was backstopping provincial action with an output-based pricing system, and that we heard a really strong preference for BC to align with the federal system rather than just directly adopt that system in BC. So with all of that in mind, we announced in 2023 that we would be moving to a made in BC output-based pricing system. That system actually took effect, came into being on 1 April this year, so we're still in the very, very early days. The system is for all facilities with more than 10,000 tonnes a year of CO2 equivalent, but smaller facilities can opt in if they want. It covers most direct facility emissions and uses a performance-based approach to incentivize reductions from industry. So this graph on the left there shows that emissions above a predetermined limit will incur a cost, and emissions below that predetermined limit will incur a incentive. The cost for the emissions above a predetermined limit is set at the same rate as the carbon tax, which continues to apply to all non-industrial fossil fuel-based emissions. So each facility is set an annual emissions limit, which is derived from a product-based emissions intensity. It's got a terrible acronym called a POE. Those who, as I said, those who emit below their facility emissions get an incentive, and that incentive is that they earn credits. And those credits can either be sold to those facilities that do have a carbon obligation, or they can be banked for a future obligation. Those who emit at their facility limit, they neither earn credits, but they don't have an obligation either. But that also means that they're missing out on an opportunity to have an increased revenue stream. And those who emit above their limit have a compliance obligation, and they can meet that compliance obligation either by making direct payments to the government, by surrendering verified offsets, or by surrendering earned credits, or some combination of all three of those. The individual facility limits that dictate whether someone can earn credits or has an obligation, that's going to be reduced at a rate of about 1% annually to make sure that we're continuously reducing emissions towards our targets. So any kind of carbon pricing tends to generate a revenue. Both the previous model that we had and the new ones that we have just introduced is going to generate revenue. Traditionally, and on a go-forward basis, this revenue has been reinvested to help industry maintain competitiveness in an economy that, you know, is increasingly valuing environmental performance and low emissions. So Harian mentioned earlier our Clean BC Industry Fund. That fund has invested since 2018, I believe, over 215 million to support projects to reduce industrial emissions directly, but also in accelerator innovation projects and feasibility studies. So really kind of supporting the whole innovation spectrum. Recent budget announcements have also confirmed that revenues from the carbon tax increases will be directed to citizens through the Climate Action Tax Credit, which is a quarterly payment that helps offset the impact of the tax paid, while still encouraging behavior change and trying to balance the impact on lower income families and individuals. This type of revenue recycling kind of directly back to individuals and families can help build public support of carbon taxes. However, that is a little bit reliant on the general public understanding that that's what's happening. And that's not necessarily the case. People don't necessarily know what the deposit in their bank is about. It just says from the government and they say thanks. They don't really necessarily see the full circle of where that money has come from, and they almost certainly don't necessarily understand, especially if you're if you're lower on the tax brackets and whatnot, that you might well get more back from a carbon tax credit than you had paid. And those are two kind of fairly fundamental points in helping the general public understand how carbon pricing works and how it doesn't necessarily come at a cost to them over time. The new system will continue to make these carbon tax credits and will continue to invest in directly in industry opportunities to move technology forward to reduce emissions at their facilities. So there have been not heaps, but there have been a few studies since we introduced the carbon tax in 2008. And overall, it's demonstrated that the carbon tax works. For example, one study showed that residential natural gas consumption has decreased between 6.9 and 10.1% as a direct result of the carbon tax. That same study showed that this response was more than 7 times the response to an equivalent change in market price. Another study showed that a 5% per litre carbon tax reduced gasoline consumption by about 8%. And a third found that an average increase of 5.8 cents per litre for diesel led to a 1.24, so about 1.25 litre decrease in monthly per capita diesel consumption, which is about 1.3% of 2008 diesel emissions, which is not massive in the grand scheme of achieving net zero, but kind of every little helps, and it was a fairly nascent carbon tax at the time. So we're pretty confident that our carbon tax it works already, and we're pretty confident that the changes we've made are going to go further to reduce species industrial emissions while striking the balance between incentivizing industry to make their own move forward and to continue investing in the new technology like the carbon capture and storage that we've been hearing about this morning. And I should note that all of those reductions were achieved while having one of the highest GDP growths in Canada, which is starting to see the decoupling of GDP and emissions. And with that, I will pause for any questions. My question slide has disappeared, but it just said questions, so you're not missing anything.